June 1940. German tanks had crossed France. The French army had been defeated. Paris had fallen. German soldiers marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe. Nazi flags appeared across the French capital. And on June 23rd, Adolf Hitler arrived to see his greatest victory in Western Europe with his own eyes. He visited the Paris Opera. He drove along the Champs-Élysées. He visited Napoleon's tomb. And then he stopped at one of the most famous structures on Earth, the Eiffel Tower. Photograph from that morning became one of the most recognizable images of World War II. Hitler stands in the foreground. Behind him rises the Eiffel Tower. France had been defeated. Paris was occupied. And the image seemed to say everything Germany wanted the world to believe. Hitler had conquered Paris, but there was one symbol of the city that refused to behave like a conquered monument: the Eiffel Tower. And the story of what happened there over the next 4 years became one of the strangest symbolic battles of the occupation. To understand why the tower mattered so much, we have to go back to the moment Paris fell. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its offensive in Western Europe. German forces attacked through Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg and France. The campaign moved with shocking speed. The French and British expected the main German attack to resemble the fighting of the First World War. Instead, German armoured formations pushed through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse and drove toward the English Channel. Allied armies were divided. British troops evacuated from Dunkirk. French defences collapsed, and on June 14th, German troops entered Paris. The French government had already abandoned the capital. Paris had been declared an open city to prevent it from being destroyed in street fighting, so the Germans entered without the enormous battle many had feared. For Parisians, the sight was almost unbelievable. German soldiers marching through streets that only weeks earlier had seemed safely behind the French army. Military vehicles passed famous cafes. German officers stood beside monuments known throughout the world. Swastika flags appeared on government buildings, and German troops marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe. But there was one monument whose symbolism was impossible to ignore: the Eiffel Tower. Today it is difficult to imagine Paris without it. But the tower was more than a tourist attraction. It was a symbol of French engineering, French modernity, French national pride. Built for the 1889 World's Fair, it had once been the tallest structure in the world. Its silhouette had become inseparable from Paris itself. So when German forces occupied the city, controlling the Eiffel Tower was politically valuable. A German flag was raised on the tower. The message was obvious: France had fallen. Germany now stood above Paris. But then something happened to the elevators. According to the famous wartime story, French workers or resistance sympathizers cut the elevator cables before the Germans could fully enjoy their prize. Whether every detail of the legend happened exactly as later retellings describe it has been debated, but the elevators were out of service during the occupation, and the symbolism was irresistible. If German soldiers wanted to climb the Eiffel Tower, they had stairs. Hundreds and hundreds of them. There is even a famous line often associated with the story: Hitler conquered France, but he never conquered the Eiffel Tower. Of course, technically, German forces controlled the tower. They used it. German flags flew from it. The German military even used the structure for communications. But symbols do not always obey military maps, and Hitler himself never climbed to the summit during his famous visit. Instead, he stood across the Seine at the Trocadér, with the tower behind him. The photograph was perfect propaganda. Hitler had always been fascinated by architecture. He viewed buildings not simply as structures, but as political statements. His plans for Berlin imagined enormous monuments designed to dwarf the architecture of other capitals. Standing in Paris must therefore have carried enormous personal meaning. Germany had defeated the country that had humiliated it after the First World War. Only 21 years earlier, the Treaty of Versailles had imposed severe conditions on Germany after its defeat in 1918. Now German soldiers controlled Versailles, they controlled Paris, and Hitler was walking through the capital of his defeated enemy. His tour lasted only a few hours. He visited the Opéra Garnier, the Madeleine, the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe, Les Invalides, Napoleon's tomb, the Sacré-Cœur, and the Eiffel Tower. At Napoleon's tomb, Hitler reportedly spent time examining the monument of another man who had attempted to dominate Europe. There was an obvious historical symbolism. Napoleon had invaded German lands more than a century earlier. Now a German dictator stood inside Napoleon's tomb after conquering France. But the Eiffel Tower offered a different kind of image. Not death, victory. Hitler standing with one of France's greatest national symbols behind him. The photographs traveled around the world. Yet while the German propaganda machine celebrated victory, life for ordinary Parisians changed dramatically. Occupation meant military control, curfews, shortages, censorship, arrests, fear, political repression, and persecution. French Jews faced increasingly severe anti-Semitic laws and eventually mass arrests and deportations. Resistance groups slowly formed. Some printed underground newspapers, others gathered intelligence. Some sabotaged railways, some helped Allied airmen escape, others hid people being hunted by German authorities. Resistance did not always mean explosions and gunfire. Sometimes, it meant refusing to cooperate, removing a sign, hiding equipment, passing information, or making occupation just slightly more difficult. That is why the story of the Eiffel Tower's elevators became so powerful. The act itself, compared with destroying a German train or attacking a military headquarters, was tiny. It could not liberate Paris, it could not destroy a German division, but psychologically, it carried a message: you may control the city, but we do not have to make the occupation comfortable for you. The Germans nevertheless found uses for the Eiffel Tower. Its height made it valuable for radio communications. Long before World War II, the tower had already demonstrated its usefulness as a communications platform. Radio had actually helped save the structure from demolition decades earlier. During the occupation, German forces took advantage of that same height. The tower became part of the communication network of occupied Paris. The Germans also took control of television equipment associated with the tower. Before the war, France had been experimenting with television broadcasting from the Eiffel Tower. The equipment was sabotaged during the German advance, but the occupiers eventually restored television transmissions. By 1943, German-controlled television programming was being broadcast in Paris, primarily for German soldiers, particularly wounded troops in military hospitals. So the Eiffel Tower had entered a strange existence. It was closed to ordinary visitors. It stood above an occupied city. German military communications passed through it. German propaganda used its image. But the monument itself remained unmistakably French. Every German flag placed on it reminded Parisians that the occupation was temporary only if Germany eventually lost the war. And by 1944, Germany was beginning to lose. On June 6th, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in history had begun. American, British, Canadian, Free French, and other Allied forces pushed inland. For weeks, German forces fought to contain them, then the front broke. In late July, Operation Cobra allowed American forces to burst out of Normandy. German positions began collapsing. Allied armies raced east. Suddenly Paris was no longer safely behind German lines. It was directly in the path of the Allied advance. Inside the city, tension exploded. Railway workers went on strike. Police joined resistance activity. Government workers stopped cooperating. Barricades appeared in the streets. French resistance fighters began openly attacking German positions. After 4 years of occupation, Paris was beginning to rise, but Hitler had no intention of simply surrendering the city. He ordered Paris defended, and as the military situation worsened, he demanded that important bridges and monuments be prepared for destruction. The German military commander of Paris was General Dietrich von Choltitz. He had arrived in the city in August 1944. The instructions coming from Hitler became increasingly extreme. Paris was not supposed to fall intact. Bridges could be destroyed. Military facilities could be demolished. Key infrastructure could be blown up. Hitler wanted to know whether Paris was burning, but it did not burn. Why Choltitz did not carry out the destruction orders completely remains debated. Later, he portrayed himself as the man who deliberately saved Paris because he recognized Hitler's madness. Historians have questioned how much of that version was self-serving. What is clear is that the catastrophic destruction Hitler demanded never happened. The bridges remained largely intact. The major monuments survived. Notre Dame remained standing. The Louvre survived. The Arc de Triomphe survived. And the Eiffel Tower survived. Then came August 25, 1944. Fighting was still taking place in Paris. German soldiers remained in parts of the city. Gunfire echoed through the streets. But 6 Paris firefighters were given an extraordinary mission. Their objective was the summit of the Eiffel Tower, and they were carrying something with them, a French flag. The group was led by Captain Lucien Saniguet. For him, the mission had a personal meaning. 4 years earlier, in June 1940, he had been involved when the French flag was removed as the Germans entered Paris. Now he was going back, but the tower was more than 300 meters high, and the elevators were not simply waiting to carry them to the top. The firefighters had to climb, step after step, higher and higher. Below them, fighting continued. German soldiers reportedly fired in their direction. Still they climbed. First level, second level, then higher. They carried the tricolor with them. Blue, white, red, the colors that had disappeared from the summit during the occupation. Finally, the 6 men reached the top, and there, high above Paris, they raised the French flag once again. For 4 years, the Eiffel Tower had stood above an occupied city. Now the tricolor flew from its summit. The symbolism could not have been stronger. Hours later, the German garrison surrendered. Paris was free. The tower had witnessed both moments: German victory in June 1940, French liberation in August 1944. And there is something almost cinematic about the symmetry. In 1940, Hitler arrived after his soldiers had conquered Paris. He posed below the Eiffel Tower. The city appeared defeated. In 1944, French firefighters climbed to the top while fighting was still happening below. They did not need a propaganda photographer standing at the Trocadero. Their message was visible from across the city. France was back. Soon the contrast became even greater. During the occupation, the Eiffel Tower had been closed to ordinary visitors. After liberation, the elevators were repaired. Allied troops were allowed to visit. American communication equipment was installed on the tower and used to connect forces around Paris with England and ports along the English Channel. The same monument the Germans had used for communications was now helping the Allied armies that had driven them out. Paris celebrated. Charles de Gaulle walked through the city. Crowds filled the Champs-Élysées. French flags covered buildings. German control had disappeared almost as dramatically as it had arrived 4 years earlier, and the Eiffel Tower remained. That is why the famous story about Hitler and the Eiffel Tower survived. It is not because Germany failed to physically occupy the monument. Germany did. A Nazi flag flew there. German military personnel used the tower. The historical reality is more complicated than the legend, but legends survive because they compress complicated events into simple images. Hitler standing beneath the Eiffel Tower in 1940. French firefighters raising the tricolor in 1944. Those 2 images tell the entire story of occupied Paris. One represented apparent German dominance, the other represented how temporary that dominance really was. And there is another irony. Hitler dreamed of creating architecture that would survive for thousands of years. He planned enormous buildings for a transformed Berlin. His architect Albert Speer designed structures intended to make visitors feel insignificant. Hitler wanted architecture to demonstrate the permanence of his regime. But Nazi Germany lasted only 12 years. The occupation of Paris lasted a little more than 4. The Eiffel Tower had already stood for more than 50 years when German troops arrived, and more than 8 decades after the liberation, it still stands. Millions of people visit it. The French flag still appears there during major national commemorations, and the famous photograph of Hitler with the tower behind him now communicates something very different from what Nazi propaganda intended. In June 1940, it represented victory. Today, we know what came next: Stalingrad, Normandy, the liberation of Paris, Berlin, and the collapse of Nazi Germany. That knowledge changes the photograph completely. Hitler is standing in front of something that will outlive him. Behind him is a city his armies will eventually abandon. Above him is a monument his regime will never permanently possess. 4 years later, the swastika would disappear. The French tricolor would return, and Paris would celebrate in the streets. So when people say Hitler conquered France, but could not conquer the Eiffel Tower, they are describing something larger than military control, because armies can capture buildings. They can occupy streets. They can raise flags. They can control governments. But controlling a symbol is different. The Eiffel Tower never stopped meaning Paris. It never stopped meaning France. And when 6 firefighters climbed through a city still under fire on August 25, 1944, they proved exactly why symbols matter. They reached the summit. They removed the symbol of occupation, and they raised the flag that had been taken down 4 years earlier. Hitler had once stood beneath the Eiffel Tower, believing Paris represented one of his greatest victories. But when the war ended, the tower was still there. Paris was still there. France was free, and the empire Hitler believed would dominate Europe for generations was gone. That was the one thing Hitler could never truly conquer in Paris. Not the steel, not the elevators, not even the tower itself, but what the Eiffel Tower represented.